everybody. It is 3 o'clock. Yeah, it's a wonderful audience. You look great out there. This is the panel titled Between Two Worlds. The organizers described this as a panel that presents the push and pull of navigating between two worlds. A novel about sisters from Brooklyn who moved to Barbados, a novel about the Egyptian upper middle class fleeing Alexandria for Israel, and a collection of stories about Mexicans and Americans of overlapping cultures and preconceptions. Geography, history, and a search for authenticity create an interplay of desire and rejection and sometimes humor about a place in time. My name is Malaika Adero. I'm the moderator today. I'm a writer, editor, book publishing consultant. I have a little boutique firm, a book studio called Adero's Literary Tribe. You can find me online. My website is my first and last name if you're interested. And I'm thrilled to be here at the Brooklyn Book Festival. It's one of my favorite book events anywhere, and particularly for New York. And I'm happy to have this a wonderful panel of writers, two that I'm meeting for the first time, and one that I've known a little while, and I'll talk more about that later. These three writers have wonderfully very different styles and voices, but their respective work illustrates the idea of physically and metaphorically being in one place and maybe having your mind and your heart, your soul in another. We know this dynamic here in the United States. I think we're quite familiar with it, being a land of hyphenates. But other places around the world near us, such as Mexico and Barbados, and further away, such as Egypt and Israel, know it too. Our featured writers this afternoon are Naomi Jackson, author of The Star Side of Bird Hill, Yitzhak Gormezano Goren, tried to give that his emphasis.
You survived my name.
The author of Alexandrian Summer, and Juan Villoro, the author of a wonderful collection of short stories, The Guilty. Juan Villoro's The Guilty is his first translated into English. Of course, he writes in Spanish. But this prolific writer of journalism fiction and long-form nonfiction has been translated into many other languages and awarded and recognized in various parts of the world, including Spain, France, and Italy. He's one of Mexico's most important writers. So again, I'm grateful to be introduced to your work for the first time. I feel the same about Yitzhak Gormezano. I'm grateful to know that this edition of Alexandrian Summer exists. It is the first time it's been translated into English. The book was first published, though, in 1978, a long time ago, but when you read this novel, you'll see how timeless it is and how intense and raw and progressive he was even in that time, 1978. Naomi Jackson is the debut author on this panel, but reading The Star Side of Bird Hill, you would not assume that this is her debut. She writes such a complete and fully realized and moving novel, so grounded it is that you would never think of her as a newbie. So let's move this closer. Can you all hear me better now?
Yeah, that's so much better.
Is that better?
Great.
All right, I don't have to repeat everything. Okay.
Will you remember? Word by word.
Word by
Malaika,
word.
Yes.
Word by word. But basically, I was just saying a few introductory remarks about these writers who you're going to hear from yourself. I'll ask them individually a question, and then I'll ask a second question that applies to all three of them, and then I'm going to open it up to you. So I hope you'll be prepared for that. Um, Yitzhak, I'll start with you. Alexandrian Summer is set in Alexandria, Egypt, in the late 40s. I think, and on the eve of the exodus of Jews from Egypt to Israel. You portray Alexandria in a way that I think might surprise many people. You describe Egypt at that time, or that city at that time, as being multicultural, multi-religious, cosmopolitan, a more free society. And I want you to talk about that, and you reveal the complexities of that life and the longing and mourning for that life. Would you describe for us the setting of the novel and how it relates to your personal story?
Yeah, first of all, about Alexandria. Alexandria is one of these special cities in the world that is located in Egypt, but people would say that it's like a bird on the back of a rhinoceros, and that she always had her back to Egypt and her face to the Mediterranean. Since she was founded by the Greeks, she always maintained this foreign element. And from the moment she was founded, she was cosmopolitan. She was a center of cultures. And some of you may know that the whole Hellenistic culture, after Athens, comes Alexandria for culture. Even in Roman times, the Romans were administrators and warriors, but culture was in Alexandria with the biblioteca. So what happened in the 40s and the 50s of the last centuries is that, or actually from the beginning of the century, many immigrants from all the Mediterranean area and even from Russia or all this of the Caucasus, all these places, Syria, everywhere, in Yemen, wherever, came to Alexandria because it was a place. First of all, it was very peaceful during the Balkan Wars. For instance, my parents were born in Turkey and Greece and Turkey were fighting all the time. So they fled to Alexandria, and Alexandria was paradise. It was the America of that time, the place where anything is possible, because it had some kind of ruler that was partly with the Ottoman Empire and partly the British. So it was colonized, of course, by the British. But when Napoleon came there, he brought French culture. So oddly, French is my mother tongue when I was born there. What happened was that this Alexandria became some kind of bubble. I would say the Hollywood bubble. We lived in Hollywood films. The funniest thing about it is that the narrator of this story is called Robbie. Now, Robbie is Robert, and Robert is myself before I adopted the name Yitzhak in Israel. But in Egypt, I was called Robert. Now, why I was called Robert? Because my parents admired Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor was an actor. This I say to the youngsters around. Very handsome. I wish I had 10th of his. Waterloo Bridge, a wonderful movie with Vivian Leigh. It's no wonder that when this baby came to the world, my parents wanted Robert, and my grandparents, who were still in tradition, said, please call him Isaac. Isaac is Yitzhak. So you may see the connection in a while. Name according to my father, like tradition was always, but my parents were westernized, modern, and they said, no way, Yitzhak, the biblical archaic name, Robert. When I came to Israel, the teacher in school said, Robert Gormezano? Now, you have to know that, I don't know how many of you know what zonah. Zonah in Hebrew is prostitute. So you just imagine what it is to be a kid, 10 years old, with a name like Gormezano, that would say Gormezona, and so it was a nightmare. And they said, you must call yourself a Hebrew name, Goren. So my parents adopted Goren. And then when my teacher said, no, Robert, no way. We are a socialist country looking for its Hebrew, Jewish identity. Then I said, yes. They wanted Reuben from the Bible. I said, no Reuben, Yitzhak. So this was my revolt to my snob parents who wanted Robert Taylor. I said, I'll go to my grandmother. So the city, and that's the last sentence, don't worry, I won't take the time of everybody. There was another factor, World War II. World War II brought all the soldiers from the British, of course, Australians, and all the nations were in Alexandria in the 40s. Now imagine that Rommel is a Nazi German general, was galloping with his Panzer tanks toward me. I was 8 months old in 1942. And I guess I said, halt! And he stopped. 100 kilometers from me, a guy called Field Marshal Montgomery helped a little to stop Rommel. And so I was saved, and maybe that's the reason I'm here. But in any case, since the Nazis didn't capture Alexandria, and there was so much army from all over the world, if it was a cosmopolitan town, it became even more during the war. And that's when I was born.
Yeah, let me ask you one quick question before I move on to Juan.
The problem is the quick answer, not a quick question.
If someone asks you what is your nationality, what do you say?
Well, look, even though I don't like the Israeli government now, definitely my nationality is Israeli. And I wish the government would change, and as far as Palestinians are concerned, I yearn for them to have a country of their own, and really hope that this will happen. But nonetheless, I feel Israeli. And I'll just add something that for many years, even though I came at age of 10 and got a Hebrew name, 2 Hebrew names on me, I felt some kind of stranger. And then in 1975, I immigrated to New York. And we were here 6 years and went back to Israel. This time, I felt at home. Why? Because I started to fight against the establishment because Israel is very Europocentric culturally. And I come from an Arab country, from Oriental cultures, so I started to fight since 1980 to bring Oriental Arab cultures into Israeli culture. And the moment I started to fight against the system, I felt alive. I felt I'm here. I felt this is my country, and therefore I fight for it, and maybe I'll prevail. And there is a nice, that's why I hope when we have peace with the Palestinians, I hope there'll be cultural merging too, not just peace with the border so they don't give us trouble and we don't give them, but there'll be a, so this thing of being part of the Middle East now with all the Daesh thing, it's like a dream when you think of what's going on in Syria. But it's really a dream that we become part of an Arab or a hybrid Middle East that includes the Arab culture and what the Hebrew culture and Western culture, because the West has conquered the world, and with globalization.
Right. We'll actually get back to that question of multiculturalism and hybridity, and how do we negotiate that and here and other parts of the world too. Juan Villoro, your collection of stories, for me, blows apart the idea that there is a stereotypic Mexican fiction, much less that there's a stereotypic Mexican. In Mariachi, the singer is revealed as, not just decoration in a restaurant or, some performer in the subway, but a full human being who has internal conflicts with the very culture that he represents. You distill the tension that exists even within, one society. In your process as a writer, because you have been published so well and received so well into other parts of the world, do you think about how your stories resonate outside of Mexico when you write?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Malaika. I'm very happy to be here to share this panel with my fellow writers. And yes, the short story Mariachi is about a Mexican icon, because singing mariachi is the most popular music in Mexico. So this is a mariachi who is a symbol of identity, but he has an identity crisis, because he has even, all kinds of intimate problems and sexual complexes and so on. So I wanted to depict the contradiction of somebody who is a public persona and is known as a stereotype, as you very aptly put it, and at the same time he has all these kind of contradictions of a genuine and real character. So I wanted to explore through these 7 stories this tension between what is expected from us and who we really are. To a certain extent, this has to do with all of us. But being Mexico, such a folkloric country, and I wanted to explore as well the way Mexicans are regarded from afar. There are many stories in which there is a connection to the foreign view, that there is somebody who wants to go to Mexico to find something really outrageous or different. In one of the stories called Amigos Mexicanos, Mexican Friends, an American journalist goes to Mexico and he wants to cover a terrible subject. He wants to find something really spectacular for his newspaper, and it happens to him the worst possible thing, and it's that everything seems to be normal in the country. So,
send him to Israel.
Well, but there were some Mexican friends who were prepared to stage some kind of very typical problems so that he could write the newspaper, for his newspaper. So this is interesting. I read once in a letter by Jack Kerouac. He was writing to William Burroughs, who was living in Mexico, and Kerouac suddenly had some fear going down to Mexico because he heard it was such a wild and dangerous country. And of course, Kerouac was not a character who was easily scared, but nonetheless, he had fear to go down to Mexico, so he wrote Burroughs and asked him, Bill, I don't know if this country is going to be too dangerous for me. And famously, William Burroughs answered, don't worry, Mexicans, they just killed their friends. So since he had no friends in Mexico, he could remain alive. So that's why the story is called Amigos Mexicanos, Mexican friends. And we have a contradictory relationship with the United States. At the end of 19th century, we had a dictator who remained 30 years in power, Porfirio Diaz, and he used to say, poor Mexico, so far away from God, so close to the United States. So for us, the United States has been both a heaven to find jobs and to have a better life, and a menace as well. And that was long before Donald Trump. So you can imagine how's the situation right now. And so when you say in Mexico, la frontera, the border, you're always referring to the border with the United States. Nobody thinks that la frontera is the border with Guatemala or Belize. We share also these borders, but we have this obsession with the United States. So in this short story collection, I try to address these issues about the Mexican and the American contradictions, the way we misunderstand ourselves, and so on. I was raised at the German school in Mexico, which was something really mysterious for me for many years, because none of my parents is German, and my father was a philosopher, and he cherished the German language because for him was the language of philosophy, so he sent me to the German school. I am the oldest one in my family, so nobody spoke German in my house. The only way to have a connection with the German language at the time was to see the Second World War movies in which all the villains would speak German. So I wondered why I am learning the language of the bad guys. And if you knew my teachers, they were really the bad guys. So I hated the school, and I think this was very important for me to love the Spanish language, because that was the only language I could speak in the courtyard. Otherwise, I would speak just German. I learned to write and read in German first and in Spanish because I was in the German group. And so I find a real pleasure, not only for my country, but for a certain exoticism. Because whenever a teacher would try to know something about the Mexican strange way of life, he would ask me, I don't understand what's going on in this country because it's going to be the Day of the Dead on the 2nd November, and I don't know how come everybody has a skull made out of sugar with his name and is going to eat the skull with his own name. This necrophilia is strange to me. So suddenly I felt a strange power and said, if I exaggerate a little bit more these habits, which are in itself strange, I'm going to fascinate my teachers. So I became a sort of, unadvertently, a sort of writer of magical realism, and I was trying to foster exoticism in the school just to be popular with my teachers. But you never know what kind of culture is going to be important to you. When I was growing up in Mexico, German was this culture that was forced into me. So the English language, rock music, American films, all of them were a way out to freedom, no? Bob Dylan's music and so on. And suddenly I discovered at the early 60s that there was a Jewish pitcher, Sandy Koufax, a Jewish pitcher, and I thought, well, he became my idol, because I think I always imagined Sandy Koufax pitching against my German teachers, no? And winning all the games. So he was my hero, and suddenly I learned at school that since he was playing for the Los Angeles Dodgers, I learned at school that California used to belong to Mexico. And the history teacher told us the story of the heroic children, which were 6 military students who were killed fighting against the United States. They lost the war, in the middle of the 19th century, and that's why California belonged to America. So I felt like
No,
a kind of...
they're giving it back.
they-
I heard
they are going to give it back.
yeah, because there are so many Mexicans.
So many
there,
Mexicans,
but,
exactly. They are eating enough guacamole right now to decide to give it back to Mexico. So it was this kind of situation in which, being a child, 12 years old, I felt like, I don't know, my hero is Jewish because I hate the German teachers and because of the stories of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and he was like the Avenger, and at the same time he's playing for the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the Los Angeles Dodgers are Americans because we lost the war with them, so I couldn't understand the world. So that's why I tell stories about contradictions of identities and trying to achieve a certain place in which you can believe in the best possible world, which is between countries.
Have you been surprised by your reception, the reception to your work around the world?
Well, of course, it's flattering when somebody is interested in your work, and I think translating is very, very important because there you can be read without other information about yourself. It's like the book living by its own. People who can read you in another language, they don't know if you belong to the left in Mexico, if you're a Catholic, if you're a Protestant, if you have been married to this person or to the other one. They just have the book, and this objectivation of your work, I think it's really rewarding. So it's always interesting to see that your work can travel to other countries. I myself, I'm a translator. I had this terrible relationship to the German language, but as many love affairs, it started very bad, but now I translate from German into Spanish.
Naomi Jackson, your story, and you are a little closer to home. The story is set in Barbados, but these characters have moved from the Bronx here in New York.
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn.
Yeah.
It's a familiar story that we know in New York because so much of the Caribbean is here, you know, in the city, and this phenomenon of families being divided in that way for all kinds of reasons. Talk about how this story came to you and why you wrote this story in two places.
Sure. So it's such a pleasure to be at the Brooklyn Book Festival. This is my first time at the festival as a panelist and not as a stalker of authors. So this is lovely and great to be here with you guys and also with Malaika, who I've known for some time. My name is Naomi Jackson, and if you missed it, I'm the author of a book called The Star Side of Bird Hill. It's a coming-of-age story set in Barbados about two Brooklyn girls, Phaedra, who's 10, and her older sister, Dion, who's 16. They go home to spend the summer with their grandmother, and I like to say all hell breaks loose the moment that they arrive in Barbados. And so we've read a lot of coming to America stories about Caribbean families and all kinds of families coming to America. I mean, America's nothing if not a country of immigrants. But I wanted to write a coming to the Caribbean story because it reflected part of my experience. I grew up in Flatbush, born and raised, and my parents are from Antigua, Barbados, and Jamaica. And I spent a lot of summers in Antigua and Barbados specifically, and one very momentous trip to Jamaica. And that experience really, and my experience growing up in Flatbush, which I like to describe as all West Indian all the time, was really interesting because I grew up in a West Indian church. My family didn't really believe in friends, and so we only had family, and we had the church, and we're in a deeply Caribbean community. And so it was strange to go to the Caribbean, and once I would get out of my enclave of cousins and family, realize that I was American. So, you know, kids would call us Yankees and make fun of our accents and just give us a really hard time. And I didn't understand that. I think having grown up in Flatbush, I felt like I was thoroughly West Indian, And so when this question of identity got thrown into relief in the Caribbean, I was very confused. Now that I'm older and I understand something about the privilege of being able to travel at all, the privilege of having a passport, the privilege of having papers, and the privilege of having money to be able to go back and forth, I think I have a more nuanced understanding of why that was that way. But in the beginning, as a kid, I was just confused by it. And so I certainly wrote this in order to write my way into that experience. But the other thing that happened is my parents would leave us. Do we have any Caribbean people in the room? Okay, great. So my parents would drop us off like the day after school would end. So like this, if school ended on a Friday, we were on the plane on Saturday, and then they would bring us back like just in time for Labor Day. And so I think a lot of Caribbean kids had this experience of having a very different life in New York and then going to the Caribbean and experiencing things like my grandmother was a really intensely believed in the roles of girls and boys. And so that was not something that was as much of a part of my life in New York. It was some part of it, but I just didn't get it. And so I went to the Caribbean and I was like, I'm a girl in this way? I can't leave the house unless one of my boy cousins is with me? What is this, right? And so I was so confused by it and wanted to write my way into that. But more importantly, my parents would threaten us all the time that they would send us to the Caribbean if we misbehaved, if we got into trouble. That's it. You're going to go to the Caribbean and you may come back, you may not come back. And so that always kind of scared me. Like every time we went, there was the possibility we weren't coming back here. And so I wanted to write into that what if question. And so this book, it's not a spoiler to say this because it's a beautiful journey that these girls go on. This book is about what happens when you think you're going somewhere for a little bit and then that place becomes your home, right? And so it was the what if question, and it was wanting to write into some of the confusion and identity questions of my childhood. That's what motivated this book.
Yeah, when you read this book, what she's saying is going to be less funny and more poignant.
Yeah.
Although the book is full of
I think it has both registers.
humor. Yeah, no, very much so, very much so. And that's one of the things I love about it. The story is about a mother, Avril, who sends her daughters from New York to where she was raised, her home, to live with her mother. One of the quotes, one of the passages that stood out for me speaks to the issues of all these books. And she writes, "For them it was impossible to separate the idea of going to Barbados from the stark memory of Avril's anger, the mother's anger. Bird Hill for Phaedra, the daughter who is sent away, at first was as much a place to be banished to as a place to call home."
Yeah. So, I mean, the dark side of I'm making light of this. So I did have a friend growing up who got pregnant. I would say less a friend than a classmate who got pregnant and was sent home to the Caribbean, to Guyana, and she never came back. She committed suicide. And so I knew that there was the dark side of it and that there was the light side, that it could as easily go left as it could go right.
Yeah.
And so when I was writing this book, I was writing into both registers, like I was talking about, the darkness and the light of all those things. But I think, life is full of rain and sun, right? And so I was writing this book to explore all those kind of that wider range of emotion and of experience that we have.
Yeah. Speaking of emotion, you also write that loving another person she knew well from watching and knowing her mother was the most dangerous thing of all. Loving a country besides the one you lived in was a recipe for heartache. So how many of us have felt that? I want to put to the panel, each of you, the question of authenticity and how it plays in literature. I love this story of the American who goes down for that authentic Mexican experience, because that's familiar to some of us too. You could say that authentic Senegalese experience, that authentic, Japanese experience, or that authentic Harlem experience, And it's not necessarily Red Rooster Restaurant for any of you who know about it. So I'd like to ask you what authenticity, the idea of authenticity means to you in literature, in storytelling.
Well, I think it's always a mystery what is really authentic, because what I think it's impossible is to try to be, let's say, Mexican on purpose, no? To be a professional Mexican. So, and this has to do more with the way somebody from abroad is going to see these characteristics of the iconic Mexican or the iconic American or whatever. All the countries, they have their stereotype, no? But this has to do more with the foreign view of the country. And strangely enough, sometimes we do try to be authentic on purpose. So we disguise ourselves as Mexicans just to show off that we have this identity and this is very strong. So I think all kind of nationalisms, when they are so extreme, they are not only politically dangerous, but they cut off something very important in culture, because culture has to do with the mixture of opinions, the combination of different ways of understanding life. So we belong in Mexico to a multicultural tradition, because when we speak about the Mexican, it's not like speaking about the Mexican corn. No? You can speak that Mexican corn has some special qualities, but Mexicans are very different from each other, no? So, and we have a strong Indian heritage. There are more than 62 languages being spoken in Mexico, 62. None of them is an official language, which is terrible. In 1994, the Zapatista guerrilla movement with the leader Marcos, they had this upheaval because they tried to remember that we belong to an Indian country. At the same time, we have a very strong Spanish heritage, but this is also difficult to accept, because that's the language of the conquistadores, the conquerors. So, for example, there's not a single statue of Hernán Cortés, the conquistador, in Mexico. So we refuse to accept this heritage. At the same time, we belong to the globalized world. We have a strong American influence, and as I told you before, we have this contradictory relationship towards the United States. So what's the Mexican? The Mexican is a mixture of all these things. Yitzhak was speaking about this wealth of cultures that you can have in Alexandria. I think that if you look close enough, all places in the world are multicultural places. And that's the most important thing between cultures, that whenever you go abroad, the lesson, the most important lesson you get is that when you go back to your country, you see it in a different way. So this gain of perspective, I think this vantage point of regarding yourself as the other can see you, is very important. And that's what literature is all about, constructing the life of the others.
Yeah, before I answer, I agree with you that the whole world has multiple culture, except the Midwest in the United States.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry. No, you know, I used to say, and even if si non è vero è ben trovato, the Italians say, apropos multiple languages. If it's not true, it's nice. It's nicely found. What do I say? I say my mother didn't have who knows what education, but she could speak 5 languages fluently. So she knew more languages than the average professor in the Midwest. That was the allusion to the Midwest. Now, authenticity. I have a friend, a poet, who's from Morocco, and he just won the Israel Prize, which is a big thing, because usually, you know what's Ashkenazi people? European people. Usually, we are very used in Israel that the white, usually male, Europeans, they won the prizes. This time, this Moroccan and his blind received a prize, the Israel prize, which is the highest prize, and he wrote a poem called "What Is It to Be Authentic?" Because we minorities, and in Israel we are a minority from the Arab countries, yes, all the time there is this thing, they don't want us to be authentic, God forbid, they want us to be like them, but all the time they say you're not authentic. That's why he made fun of all these things, to be authentic. I think that authenticity has to do with two things, stereotypes and racism. What it means to be authentic, you know, in a world where to be authentic is that so that I can say, here you are, black, yellow, whatever, brownish, café au lait. You know, the French would, a euphemism for us, well, I'm brown in my because I come from an Arab country, that maybe I look white, but in my soul, I'm from the East. So the French call it café au lait, coffee with milk, which is nice. On the other hand, if you talk of authenticity in literature, I think that if a writer thinks of being authentic, he won't be. Being authentic is something that is either there or not. And if you are authentic as a writer, you don't write from your brains to show off, I'm a writer and I do this, this bullshit. If you just write from your soul, from your guts, you must be authentic because people are the same everywhere. And apart from the Alexandrian trilogy, I'm writing now about a great Renaissance lady called Donna Gracia Mendez, and therefore I had to do a lot of research. I'm writing her first person singular, as if she is myself, because I know myself, and I know myself as a woman, and that's it. That's my authenticity, and the last sentence would be that there were very nice reviews. They call it rave reviews. That's something I learned here. There were rave reviews about Alexandrian Summer. But the review that is endearing to me is when someone wrote, when you read this novel, you just feel you're sitting at the cafeteria in Alexandria and feel the breeze of the Mediterranean coming to you. So he didn't say, I'm a great writer who writes about themes and contradicting themes of identity, schmidentity. He just said that it feels like a breeze, like good sex or things like that. So live literature. What is it to be authentic?
Yeah, you gave us something we can feel. I have to confess that I have referred to myself as a professional black person, and it was in the context of a diversity issue at work. But my point was, in that case, is that the issues around diversity and a dialogue around diversity become absurd and often superficial too. And my point was diversity, and specifically in publishing, isn't casting. It isn't about how we look, how brown we are, how kinky we are, or something. It's, for me, about a commitment, curiosity, and interest in an embrace of not only my individual story, but my collective story. in how I identify as a Black person, which I think it's critical in publishing and in storytelling, one, to have a point of view, to know who you are, to come from that place, as Yitzhak referred to, but have a very wide embrace. Naomi, what does
So
authenticity?
I think I agree with where Yitzhak started in terms of saying that authenticity is a ruse. I think if I was concerned most with authenticity in the sense of writing from the heart, writing truly from these characters' experiences, going to the deepest depths of what they were feeling. I'm writing in this book from the perspective of a 10-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 63-year-old. So I had to hang out in the minds and hearts of those three characters really intensely and immerse myself in the depths of both their joy and their grief. So if I was concerned with authenticity, it was about authenticity of emotion and my integrity as a writer in terms of telling the emotional truth of the story and going past my own limitations to the things that would make me uncomfortable writing about. So the mother in this novel is mentally ill. There's a gay character in this book. There's lots in this book that goes beyond what makes me comfortable. I like to actually share the fact that there's a death scene in this book that I probably circled around for the better part of 2 years because I was so afraid to write it. And so for me, the authenticity part of this book was about stepping up very closely to the things that most deeply scared me and then walking over the cliff. And so I think that when people talk about being really deeply moved and crying when they read the book, it's because I was crying while I was writing it and I was deeply there. In every single difficult moment and also in the most joyful moments. But I will say that there was some angst here about the accuracy of the language specifically. So because the book is set in Barbados and I have actually spent the least time in Barbados, I've spent way more time with my dad's family in Antigua. I had to go and spend a summer there and research these things. And I was scared that it wasn't going to sound right, that Bajans would complain that it didn't quite seem like Barbados, and that hasn't happened yet. I'm going to Barbados to launch the book in late November, so we'll see. Like, I'll get my reviews. I did have one young person who heckled me, and it's like, oh, people would say fella instead of saying guy, and I was like, okay, sure. And so I actually appreciate that, though, because I think that at any point at which I become so far removed from people that people can't say things like that to me, it's a loss to me because I'm not going to write guy in the next book. It will be fella because I'll have taken that note and taken it into account. So I do think if there was some angst or something that I was paying attention to as I was writing the book, it was accuracy about the dialect, accuracy about the culture, and about certain kinds of things. And so I had readers who were Bajan who read the book specifically for like they did an authenticity edit. That was mostly about, like, is the dialect correct here? Is the syntax quite right? And I think I got it right, but if I did, it's because I had a lot of help. Yeah.
Thank you. We have.
I do agree about accuracy. That's very important, of course, to be accurate. But to be accurate is really almost technical. You take the technical element of being accurate that you research or whatever, and as soon as you put yourself into it and you take it to yourself, that's the thing. And it's important also you cannot write universally if you write universally. You write about yourself. But you have to be very careful not to be narcissistic. So that's the difference. To be yourself, but not to be narcissistic and try to show off yourself. So it's this like you said, all the time contradictions. It's these combinations between going out and going in, and going around and going back in. That's the mystery of it, and that's why this intelligent panel or any cannot describe the thing, the wonder of being creative.
We have just a few minutes, a little less than 10 minutes, and I do want to open it up for questions, and we've got hands going up. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Really funny and very memorable.
No.
Did
No.
you all hear the question? She's asking how did he become so funny if he's always that funny?
No, not always. There are writers that are always funny, and there are writers that are always sad. And there are these strange combinations. For example, I like very much Isaac Bashevis Singer, a great novelist who can be at the same time funny and sad. And I think that's very difficult to achieve. And well, this short story collection goes more into the comedy territory than other books of mine. But well, I try to write both kinds of stories, and sometimes the comical aspect is stronger than other times. No? I don't know. It has to do, I think, with the wealth, the experience of living in which you have very, very different reactions. So this is a funny book, but the other ones are not as funny as this one, I guess.
Yes, sir. Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Another question. Okay, go ahead.
I certainly, Drown, Juno Diaz's Drown, I studied and read and taught a lot while I was working on this book. Everything by Edwidge Danticat, who was born in Haiti but then spent a lot of time in Flatbush. I think that she's very concerned with this question of the Haitian American diaspora. And so I think those two writers for me certainly speak to that Caribbean American experience. Yeah.
Hi. Speak up.
Come closer because we can't hear you. Yeah. Oh, Lord, that's a big question. Sure, I'll be happy to repeat that question. Thanks, April. So it's a question about the term Bullerman. There's a character in my book who has the name Bullerman Jean, which just means like he's in Antigua, you would call someone anti-man. So it's a derogatory term, although I think there are some gay people who would kind of throw it around and have a joke about it because what are you going to do? I think it kind of is jokey in the same way that some people might call themselves dykes. And so it's both a derogatory term and one that I think some people might embrace and joke with sometimes. I'm not sure that I have time to speak to the like big question of what is the experience of gay people in the Caribbean. I would say that I wrote this book. I felt that Edwidge Danticat actually has a gay character in her book, The Dewbreaker, Nadine, who's a nurse. And I wrote this book because I wanted to write gay characters into Caribbean literature. I felt like If you were to read a lot of Caribbean books, you would think that there were no gay people at all. And so I wanted to write a character into that discourse, and also to write somebody who was true to the time. So I didn't want to write someone who was like, had all these rights and ability and all this thing that is more true to 2015 than it was to 1989 when the book was set. I wrote that character in part because I had grown up in the Caribbean, and there was a guy who worked at the little chop shop around the corner, and he was very much derided and disrespected, and I loved him. And I wanted to write, from the perspective of Phaedra at least, about a child who was confused about why being gay was so horrible, right? And so I chose to write from her perspective, and I chose to write a character who was true to the time. And I don't know, that would be a separate panel. It's something I'm actually working on. And if you want to think about it more, Chinela Aparantas Under the Adala Trees is like the place to go next. 1 minute. Okay. And this side. Okay.
Okay, all right.
I don't think
Quickly,
they can-
you, and the book signing is out to the left.
At the Greenlight bookstore table to the left. So come talk to us there. Yeah. So